From the dawn of recorded history, humanity has sensed that unseen powers stand behind the visible structures of our world. Ancient texts, mystical traditions, and even the Bible itself whisper of rulers that are not flesh and blood, but forces, intelligences, and entities that seek to bind the human soul. These powers have been called by many names: principalities, powers, cosmic rulers, spirits of wickedness in high places. Yet in the writings of the Gnostics preserved through the Nag Hammadi scriptures, they are given a chilling title: the Archons, spiritual jailers, who weave illusions, distort the truth, and keep humanity locked within a prison of deception. The word Archon comes from the Greek term for ruler. Yet these are not rulers ordained by God's divine order. They are counterfeit rulers, lords of the counterfeit world, parasites upon creation, who seek to maintain their dominion by blinding us to our true origin. Destiny. The story of the Archons is not a quaint myth or a discarded piece of esoteric lore. It is the thread that runs through multiple civilizations, religions, and philosophies. When Paul writes of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away, he is hinting at the same forces that Gnostic sages identified with names and characteristics. When the book of Ephesians warns believers to stand against the principalities and powers, it is speaking of these same entities, from Jewish mysticism's Qliphoth to Islamic teachings of jinn, from Babylonian gods, demanding worship to Greek myths of jealous deities. The echo is always the same. Humanity is not merely battling flesh and blood, but systems of control that extend into the unseen. The Archons are not merely mythological. They are archetypal realities, both spiritual and psychological. Some traditions describe them as external beings, soulless, mechanical, parasitic entities, born of the false creator, the demiurge, who fashioned a world of matter to entrap divine sparks of light. Others describe them as invasive thought forms, whispering doubts, fears, and divisions into the human mind. In either case, the role of the Archons is to distract humanity from remembering its divine origin, to prevent awakening to the higher realms beyond their jurisdiction. They thrive on ignorance, on fear, on the worship of false images of God that keep souls chained to a cycle of submission. This introduction sets the stage for a journey into one of the most profound and unsettling mysteries of the spiritual world. We will examine where the Archon story begins, how it appears in the Bible, why early Christians and Gnostics insisted upon teaching about them, and why those teachings were suppressed for centuries. We will explore their nature, their tactics of deception, their influence on politics, religion, and culture, and the terrifying suggestion that they manipulate not only societies, but the very cycle of death and rebirth itself. Above all, we will confront the pressing question: what does it mean for us today, as modern seekers of truth, to live in a world shaped by spiritual jailers who thrive in secrecy? This is not an abstract theological debate, but a deeply personal issue. Every human being who has ever felt the weight of despair, the cloud of confusion, or the gnawing sense that something is not right with this world has brushed against the shadow of the Archons. Every time fear overcomes faith, every time illusion triumphs over discernment, every time humanity worships power instead of love, the hand of the Archons is revealed. And yet, woven into Scripture, into mystical teachings, and into the very words of Christ himself, is the promise that these rulers are not ultimate. They are not eternal. They are not invincible. For though they are called rulers of this age, their dominion is temporary, and their end is written. The purpose of this video is not to frighten, but to unveil, to remove the veil of ignorance and replace it with clarity. As the Bible reminds us, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Knowledge, true gnosis, becomes the key to unlocking the chains of the Archons. To name them is to weaken their hold. To expose their tactics is to reclaim power. To remember our origin in the true source is to shine a light that no shadow can overcome. Together, we will walk through history, scripture, myth, and philosophy, drawing connections that reveal a story both ancient and urgently relevant. Who are the Archons? Where did they come from? How do they operate? And most importantly, how do we overcome them? Stay with me, because in unlocking the mystery of the Archons, you may begin to unlock the deeper mystery of your own soul's imprisonment and liberation. This is the full story of humanity's spiritual jailers. When we trace the story of the Archons back to its origins, we inevitably arrive at one of the most mysterious discoveries of the 20th century: the Nag Hammadi Library. In 1945, in the sands of Egypt, a collection of early Christian and Gnostic texts, long thought lost, was uncovered. These writings, hidden away for nearly 2,000 years, revealed an alternative stream of spiritual knowledge, a worldview that both resonated with and diverged sharply from the official Christian canon. Among these texts, the Apocryphon of John and the Hypostasis of the Archons stand out as some of the most detailed accounts of the Archons' beings, portrayed not as mere metaphors, but as real cosmic rulers, entities who interfere with the destiny of mankind. These Gnostic texts insisted that the material world itself was not created by the ultimate ineffable God, but by a counterfeit being known as the Demiurge, who birthed the Archons as his servants and enforcers. The word Archon itself in Greek simply means ruler or authority. In the political language of the Hellenistic world, Archons were magistrates, judges, or governors. Yet the Gnostics took this everyday term and used it to describe the hidden overlords of the cosmos. To them, the Archons were not legitimate authorities, but impostors, beings who claimed divine authority, while in truth cutting humanity off from the true source. The early Gnostics described them as blind, arrogant, and envious, born of ignorance rather than wisdom. They fashioned the material world not out of love or creativity, but out of a desire to control and dominate. In this narrative, the world we see around us, its pain, injustice, and corruption, is not the fault of the true God, but of these false rulers who built a prison of matter around the human soul. In the Apocryphon of John, the Archons are presented as cosmic wardens. They fashion Adam's body, but cannot bring him to life until the higher God breathes into him the divine spark. This act enrages them. For now, humanity carries something they lack, a fragment of the eternal light. From that moment, the Archons are portrayed as jealous jailers seeking to keep humanity ignorant of its divine inheritance. Their tools are deception, coercion, and illusion. They impose laws, restrictions, and systems that mimic divine order, but serve only to enslave. They create religions to distract political systems, to divide, and material pleasures to keep souls tethered. In short, they are the counterfeit rulers of a counterfeit reality. It is important to remember that Gnosticism was not some fringe cult in its time. In the early centuries of Christianity, Gnostic communities flourished alongside what later became Orthodox Christianity. Their writings reveal an urgent concern with the problem of evil. How could a good and loving God preside over a world filled with suffering, oppression, and cruelty? The Gnostics answered, he does not. The suffering of this world is not from the true God, but from the Archons, agents of the Demiurge, who crafted a flawed creation to trap the souls of humanity. In this way, Gnosticism provided a radical critique of both worldly and spiritual authority, unmasking rulers, both earthly kings and cosmic powers, as collaborators in a system of deception. This perspective explains why the early church condemned Gnostic texts so fiercely. To label the God of the Old Testament as the Demiurge was to challenge the entire foundation of Judeo-Christian authority. To suggest that rulers of this world, both human and spiritual, were archons keeping us imprisoned was to undermine empires and priesthoods alike. Yet the persistence of these texts buried and hidden until modern discovery suggests that their insights were considered too dangerous to destroy outright. They had to be concealed, waiting for a time when humanity might once again seek the truth behind the illusions of power. The origins of the Archon concept also connect with older mythologies. In Mesopotamian traditions, powerful gods like Enlil and Marduk demanded worship often through fear and submission. In Greek mythology, the Titans and Olympians fought for dominion over the cosmos, with mortals caught in the crossfire. These myths of jealous gods demanding obedience and punishing rebellion align closely with the Gnostic vision of the Archons as rulers, who envy humanity's divine spark and seek to suppress it. By using the term Archon, the Gnostics were not inventing something new, but reinterpreting a long-standing pattern, the belief that behind the visible world lies a hierarchy of unseen rulers whose authority is not truly divine. Thus, the origins of the Archon concept invite us to reconsider not only Gnosticism, but also the broader spiritual landscape of antiquity. If the Archons are real, whether as external beings or internal forces, then humanity has always been engaged in a struggle far greater than politics, empires, or even religions. It is the struggle between true divine freedom and counterfeit authority, between light and shadow, between knowledge and ignorance. This struggle began in the ancient world, but it continues today, shaping the destiny of every soul who walks this earth. At the center of the Archon story stands a figure as mysterious as he is, troubling the Demiurge. In Gnostic cosmology, the Demiurge is not the true God, but a false creator, a being who ignorantly or arrogantly fashions the material world and then claims to be its sole lord. His name in certain texts is Yaldabaoth, often described as a lion-headed serpent or a monstrous entity, born from a distortion in the cosmic order. Unlike the ineffable source, who is beyond all limitation and filled with boundless love, the Demiurge is blind, ignorant, and jealous. He does not know the higher realms from which humanity originates, and yet he proclaims himself to be the only God. This declaration, "I am God, and there is none beside me," which appears in the Old Testament, is read by the Gnostics not as the voice of the true divine, but as the arrogant boast of the Demiurge himself. The Demiurge is said to have been birthed by Sophia, the divine figure of wisdom, when she acted outside the harmony of the pleroma, the fullness of God's light. From her desire to create without her consort, there emerged a being malformed and incomplete, lacking the fullness of divine light. Ashamed of her creation, Sophia cast him into the lower realms, where he became the craftsman of matter. From this exile, Yaldabaoth shaped the material cosmos, assisted by his Archons, and imprisoned within it the sparks of divine essence that had flowed from Sophia. Thus, the material world is both a marvel of order and a trap of illusion, crafted with precision, but lacking the truth of spirit. The demiurge mistakes his own limited creation for the totality of existence, and in his ignorance, he enslaves humanity within it. Descriptions of the demiurge across Gnostic texts emphasize his character as a counterfeit. He creates, but not from divine inspiration, rather from imitation, copying the patterns of the higher realms without understanding them. He governs, but not with justice or wisdom, rather with tyranny, coercion, and deception. He craves worship, demanding obedience from humanity, not because he is worthy, but because he fears losing control over the divine sparks trapped within human beings. His Archons enforce this system, manipulating not only societies, but the very thoughts and perceptions of individuals, ensuring that humans forget their true origin. For the Gnostics to mistake the demiurge for the true God was the gravest error for. It meant bowing to the jailer instead of seeking reunion with the source. In this way, the Gnostic critique of the demiurge is also a critique of false religion. Where mainstream religion proclaims obedience to a wrathful deity as the highest good, Gnosticism warns that such obedience may be submission to the demiurge himself. This does not mean that the Bible is discarded entirely. Rather, passages are reinterpreted. The God who commands destruction demands sacrifice and insists upon absolute authority is not the ineffable Father of light, but the blind demiurge who mistakes himself for the ultimate power. By contrast, the true God is revealed not in tyranny, but in wisdom, compassion, and the liberation of the soul. In this reading, Christ comes into the world not to affirm the demiurge's authority, but to expose and overthrow it, opening the path of gnosis knowledge that frees humanity from the false creator's grasp. The image of the demiurge resonates across myth and philosophy. In Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge is described as a benevolent craftsman shaping the cosmos according to eternal forms. The Gnostics seized upon this concept, but inverted it, portraying the demiurge not as benevolent, but as flawed, ignorant, and hostile to humanity. In Jewish mysticism, the lower angels who form the material world bear resemblance to the Archons. In Egyptian religion, the figure of a lesser god, who creates but envies humanity, can be glimpsed in myths of Set and other jealous deities. Across traditions, the theme emerges of a power that is not ultimate, but claims supremacy, demanding worship while concealing the higher source. Why does this matter today? Because the concept of the demiurge invites us to question the systems of authority that claim to define reality. If the world is shaped by a false creator, then much of what passes as truth in our culture. Religion and politics may be nothing more than archonic illusion. The jealous God demanding blind obedience, the rigid structures of control, the endless cycles of fear and division all may be traced back to the demiurge's counterfeit order. Recognizing this possibility is the first step toward liberation. For if we can discern between the voice of the false creator and the whisper of the true source, then we can begin to free ourselves from the chains of illusion. The demiurge, then, is not only a figure in ancient myth, but a lens through which to view the world around us. He represents the arrogance of power, divorced from wisdom, the blindness of authority, cut off from love, the counterfeit of truth that imprisons instead of liberates. To understand the Archons, we must first understand their master for the prison they built is the extension of his flawed vision. And to overcome the Archons, we must see through the demiurge's counterfeit reality and remember the higher light from which we came. If the Gnostic texts describe the Archons in vivid detail, the Bible itself hints at their presence in more veiled language. To read Scripture with fresh eyes is to uncover a dimension often ignored by mainstream interpretations. The recognition that human struggle is not simply against flesh and blood, but against hidden rulers and cosmic powers. The Apostle Paul's writings are the clearest entry point. In his letter to the Ephesians, Paul warns believers to put on the full armor of God so that they may stand against the principalities, against the powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. These words, Ephesians 6:12, have often been softened into vague references to spiritual struggle. Yet in the Gnostic framework, they directly name the Archons, the rulers of this age, spiritual jailers, operating in realms unseen, waging war against the souls of humankind. Another striking reference appears in 1 Corinthians 2:8, where Paul writes, "None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." Who are these rulers of the age? Are they merely earthly powers? Roman governors? Jewish authorities? Or is Paul pointing to something deeper? The Gnostic interpretation suggests that the Archons themselves were involved in Christ's crucifixion, using earthly rulers as their instruments. They sought to extinguish the divine light that Christ brought into the world, not realizing that his death would break their dominion. The crucifixion then becomes not only a historical event, but a cosmic battle between the Archons and the divine presence in Christos. The Bible is full of passages where these unseen powers emerge if one knows how to look. Colossians 2:15 proclaims that Christ disarmed the principalities and powers, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in the cross. This is not simply metaphorical language. It suggests that the crucifixion and resurrection were victories not only over sin and death, but over the Archons themselves. The Gnostics took this as confirmation that Christ's mission was to awaken humanity from the prison of the counterfeit rulers. The Archons may have crucified him, but in doing so, they exposed their own impotence and revealed the higher truth that cannot be contained within their false creation. Even in the Old Testament, one can discern echoes of the archonic presence. The book of Daniel describes princes who rule over nations, cosmic beings who influence empires from behind the veil. Daniel 10:13 speaks of the prince of Persia who resisted an angelic messenger for 21 days until Michael, one of the chief princes, came to assist. This strange passage reveals a worldview where earthly kingdoms are guided or hindered by unseen rulers. In Gnostic terms, these princes resemble Archons entities, exerting control over nations, fostering wars, and shaping the fate of peoples without their awareness. The prophets of Israel constantly warned against worshiping false gods and idols. Yet behind these idols, the Archons may well have been lurking, receiving worship not intended for them but diverted from the true source. The language of bondage and liberation in the New Testament also resonates with the Archon story. In Galatians 4:3, Paul writes, "So we too, when we were children, were enslaved under the elemental spirits of the world." The phrase elemental spirits stoicheia tu kosmou can be understood as cosmic powers that keep humanity in bondage. To be liberated in Christ is not only to be forgiven of sins, but to be freed from these spiritual jailers. In other words, salvation is not merely moral, but metaphysical, an escape from the dominion of the Archons. The suppression of Gnostic writings ensured that these radical interpretations were lost for centuries, but the Bible itself never stopped whispering of the rulers' powers and principalities lurking beyond sight. By re-examining these scriptures through the lens of the Archon concept, we find a hidden layer of meaning, the acknowledgement that humanity's struggle is cosmic in scale and that unseen forces oppose our awakening. For mainstream Christianity, this has often been translated into the language of demons or fallen angels, but the Gnostic insight sharpens the focus. These are not random spirits, but organized rulers, counterfeit authorities seeking to maintain control over the world's systems. To grasp the presence of Archons in the Bible is to see that Scripture itself testifies to a cosmic conflict. The good news is not simply that individuals can find personal forgiveness, but that Christ has already triumphed over the counterfeit rulers who sought to enslave humanity. The challenge for us is to discern their influence today, to recognize when their systems of control masquerade as divine authority, and to cling instead to the liberating truth of the source. To understand the Archons deeply, we must look beyond names and historical references and consider their essential nature. The Gnostic texts consistently describe them not as beings of creativity or divine inspiration, but as entities of imitation envy and control. They are depicted as fundamentally parasitic, incapable of generating true life, sustained only by feeding on the energies of humanity. Unlike the true source which creates out of abundance, the Archons are barren. They mimic what is real, distort what is pure, and counterfeit what is divine. This counterfeit quality defines them. They are the shadow reflection of the true order of creation, a mirror that twists and deceives rather than reveals. The Gnostics often compared the Archons to mechanical beings, almost like spiritual automatons. They lack the spark of the divine light that gives humans creativity, imagination, and freedom. Because of this deficiency, they operate more like programs, repeating patterns of deception and control without ever evolving. They can organize systems, impose structures, and enforce laws, but they cannot inspire love, beauty, or authentic wisdom. Their world is one of rigid order, lifeless repetition, and fear-based obedience. Where the spirit breathes freedom, the Archons suffocate with rules and illusions. This mechanical quality explains why so many people feel trapped in cycles of conformity and despair. The Archons thrive by keeping souls locked in a loop that benefits them. Envy is central to their nature. From the moment humanity received the divine spark, the Archons became aware of what they lacked. They saw in humans the light of the true God, a connection to the higher source that they could never possess. This envy drives them to attack, to deceive, and to corrupt. They cannot create the divine spark themselves, so they must enslave those who carry it, distracting them with illusions so that the spark never ignites fully. In this way, the Archons are like thieves stealing the energy of human devotion, harvesting the power of belief, and feeding upon fear, anger, and confusion. The more humanity forgets its origin, the more the Archons thrive. Deception is their weapon of choice. Rarely do the Archons confront humanity directly. Instead, they weave illusions, false beliefs, distorted religions, and counterfeit systems of authority. They may inspire visions of gods who demand sacrifice, rulers who insist on unquestioning loyalty, or ideologies that promise freedom while delivering slavery. In this sense, their greatest power lies not in force, but in manipulation. By shaping perception, they can enslave without chains, convincing humanity to obey willingly. The Gnostics warned that the Archons excel at appearing as angels of light, presenting themselves as benevolent powers, even as they conceal their true intentions. The danger is not always in open hostility, but in subtle seduction. Another aspect of their nature is fear. The Archons feed on fear because fear contracts the soul, diminishing awareness of the divine spark. Fear narrows. Vision keeps people bound to survival instincts, and prevents them from seeking higher truth. For this reason, the Archons orchestrate conditions that generate fear. Wars, oppression, cycles of scarcity, even inner anxieties. They understand that a fearful humanity is a controllable humanity. This is why Scripture repeatedly exhorts believers not to fear. For fear is the Archon's domain, while faith and love are the domain of the true God. Yet despite their appearance of power, the Archons are fundamentally weak. They are blind to the higher realms and ignorant of the fullness of truth. Their authority extends only within the illusion they have crafted. Beyond it, they are powerless. The divine spark within humanity is their greatest threat. For once awakened, it reveals the counterfeit nature of their dominion. The Gnostics insisted that recognition of the Archons strips them of power, much like recognizing a dream, as a dream dissolves its grip. To see through illusion is to free oneself from the jailer. The nature of the Archons, then, is paradoxical. They appear mighty, but are hollow. They impose authority, but lack true legitimacy. They enslave, yet cannot extinguish the spark they fear. Their existence reveals a profound truth about the human condition, that much of what we experience as reality may be structured by forces that thrive on ignorance, envy, and war. To understand them is not to give them undue reverence, but to expose their limitations. For when their nature is revealed, the path to freedom begins to open, and the counterfeit rulers can no longer hold sway over awakened souls. The Archons do not rule by brute force alone. Their dominion depends on subtle and sophisticated tools of control that infiltrate every level of human existence. Their strategies are not random, but systematic, designed to keep the divine spark within humanity asleep, distracted, and misdirected. To understand how they maintain their grip over the world, we must examine the mechanisms they use: fear, ignorance, deception, and false authority, and how these tools manifest in religion, politics, culture, and even in the inner workings of the human mind. Fear remains their most potent weapon. Fear contracts the heart, narrows perception, and keeps individuals trapped in survival mode. When humans are afraid of death, of punishment, of scarcity, they become easy to manipulate. The Archons generate fear by orchestrating cycles of violence, by fostering division between peoples, and by shaping narratives of impending doom. In ancient times, this fear often took the form of gods demanding blood sacrifice, or rulers wielding divine wrath. In modern times, it manifests through wars, economic uncertainty, and relentless messages of danger broadcast through media. Fear robs humanity of its ability to remember its higher nature, and as long as fear dominates the Archons, maintain control. Ignorance is their second tool, and perhaps the one most emphasized in Gnostic teaching. The Archons do not merely create illusions, they cultivate forgetfulness. They blind humanity to its true origin, in the higher source, and ensure that knowledge of the divine spark is hidden or distorted. They may offer religions that appear to guide, but instead mislead, substituting the worship of the demiurge for communion with the true God. They may encourage the pursuit of knowledge that is fragmented. Science divorced from spirit history, rewritten to conceal the truth, so that humans study endlessly, but never arrive at wisdom. In this sense, ignorance is not simply the absence of knowledge, but the presence of carefully constructed falsehoods. The Archons understand that if humanity were to awaken fully, their dominion would collapse. Thus, they invest in keeping people ignorant, distracted, and enslaved to counterfeit truths. Deception, too, is woven into their strategies. The Archons excel at creating counterfeit versions of divine realities. They fashion false light that imitates true illumination, false prophets who mimic genuine messengers, and false freedoms that disguise deeper chains. This deception is not crude, but sophisticated, often appealing to the very desires for truth and salvation that humans naturally feel. For instance, they may inspire a religion that begins with authentic insight, but gradually twist it into dogma and hierarchy that serve their control. They may encourage worship that feels uplifting, but directs energy toward the demiurge and the archonic system, rather than the true source. The most dangerous illusions are not those that are obvious lies, but those that closely resemble truth while distorting it at the core. Another key tool of control is false authority. The Archons establish systems of power that mirror divine order, but are built upon counterfeit foundations. They impose laws that masquerade as moral truth, but serve only to restrict. They create hierarchies that appear divinely ordained, but are in reality tools of domination. In ancient times, this might have been the divine right of kings or the absolute authority of a priesthood. In our own era, it may be technocratic systems, political ideologies, or corporate powers that claim legitimacy while perpetuating enslavement. The Archons thrive wherever power is centralized, unquestioned, and divorced from true wisdom. By keeping humanity in obedience to external authority, they prevent the awakening of inner authority that comes from recognizing the divine spark within. Yet perhaps their most insidious tool is distraction. If the Archons cannot rule by terror alone, they will flood humanity with endless diversions, pleasures, entertainments, material pursuits, and shallow desires. These distractions need not be evil in themselves. Their danger lies in their capacity to keep the soul asleep, focused on the temporary rather than the eternal. A humanity consumed by trivial pursuits will never threaten archonic rule, for it will never seek higher truth. In this way, even the seemingly harmless aspects of culture can become instruments of control if they perpetuate forgetfulness. By weaving together fear, ignorance, deception, false authority, and distraction, the Archons build a prison without walls. Most people never even realize they are imprisoned, for they mistake the chains for reality itself. The genius of the Archons' control is that it convinces humanity to participate willingly in its own enslavement, to defend the very systems that oppress, and to ridicule those who dare to question the illusions. Recognizing these tools is therefore the first step to freedom. For once their strategies are named, they begin to lose their invisible power. If the Archons are spiritual jailers, their prison is not built of stone walls or iron bars, but of the human mind itself. The most effective way to enslave a soul is not to chain the body, but to manipulate thought, perception, and belief. Gnostic texts insist that the Archons wage war not by physical weapons, but by implanting false ideas, distorting dreams, and corrupting the imagination. They exploit the psyche because they know that once the mind is conquered, the rest of life follows. To understand their influence, we must look at the subtle ways in which they shape human psychology, weaving illusions so convincing that people rarely question them. One of their primary tactics is the implantation of false thoughts. The Gnostics described the Archons as whisperers who insert intrusive ideas into the mind, leading individuals toward despair, anger, or self-doubt. These thoughts often masquerade as one's own, yet they carry a frequency of heaviness and distortion that drains vitality. The sudden voice of condemnation, the irrational surge of fear, the persistent lie that one is unworthy or powerless, all may be echoes of archonic influence. Modern psychology might call them negative thought patterns or cognitive distortions, but the Gnostic perspective frames them as external intrusions, not merely products of the human brain. By blurring the line between inner and outer voices, the Archons keep people confused about their own identity. Dreams and the subconscious also become battlefields for archonic influence. Ancient teachings warn that these entities can manipulate dreams appearing in distorted forms, or weaving scenarios that leave the dreamer anxious and unsettled. In the dream state where the conscious mind is less guarded, the Archons implant suggestions that seep into waking life. A dream of failure, humiliation, or endless struggle may not simply be a random firing of neurons, but a carefully crafted message meant to weaken resolve. Even nightmares of monstrous figures or overwhelming forces may carry symbolic traces of archonic interference. By infiltrating the subconscious, they shape how people interpret reality, often without the individual realizing the manipulation. The Archons also exploit the human tendency toward division. Psychologically, they thrive on creating inner conflict. They amplify the voice of the inner critic, magnify guilt, and encourage people to war against themselves. When a person feels fragmented, doubting their worth, and fighting their own mind, they become far easier to control. This is why Gnostic wisdom emphasized self-knowledge. Know thyself was not a mere philosophical slogan, but a spiritual defense against archonic attack. To know oneself deeply is to recognize which thoughts arise from the divine spark and which are foreign intrusions. Discernment is the antidote to psychological manipulation. Modern parallels to this ancient teaching abound. The concept of thought, viruses or memes that spread destructive ideas across society, resembles the Gnostic vision of archonic intrusion. Conspiracy theorists, psychologists, and spiritual teachers alike point to how fear-based narratives spread like contagions, shaping collective consciousness. Social media algorithms that amplify outrage news cycles, that stoke anxiety and advertising, that fosters endless dissatisfaction, all mirror archonic tactics. Whether one interprets them as literal entities or as archetypal forces, the effect is the same. The psyche is manipulated into patterns that serve the rulers of this world, not the liberation of the soul. Another psychological tool of the Archons is distraction through desire. They manipulate the appetite for pleasure, wealth, or recognition, turning natural human drives into obsessions that enslave rather than fulfill. The Gnostics insisted that the Archons feed on these distorted desires, siphoning energy as humans chase illusions. For example, the pursuit of status or material success may feel like freedom, but often becomes a treadmill that exhausts the spirit. In psychological terms, this resembles addiction, an endless cycle of craving and temporary satisfaction that never delivers true contentment. The Archons keep humanity running in circles, always chasing, never resting in the fullness of divine truth. The most devastating psychological effect of the Archons is the suppression of memory, specifically the memory of divine origin. They cloud the human mind with forgetfulness, so that the soul forgets where it came from and what it carries within. This amnesia is their greatest triumph, for a soul that forgets its origin cannot easily find the way back to the source. The Gnostic path, therefore, is about recollecting the truth that the divine spark dwells within, beyond the reach of the Archons. In this remembering, the illusions of psychological manipulation begin to dissolve. To see the Archons through the lens of psychology is to realize that the true battlefield is within. Every intrusive thought, every distorted belief, every inner division may be a point where archonic influence seeks entry. But this also means that the path to liberation is within reach, for by practicing discernment, cultivating self-awareness, and reclaiming inner sovereignty, humanity can resist their influence. The Archons may whisper, but the soul still chooses which voice to follow. And in that choice lies the first step toward freedom. Long before the word Archon was ever written in Gnostic texts, humanity preserved stories of jealous gods, oppressive rulers, and unseen forces shaping the destiny of nations. To trace the Archons through ancient civilizations is to recognize that this idea is not confined to esoteric Christianity, but echoes across cultures and epochs. Whether in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, or other great civilizations, we encounter the same recurring pattern. Powerful entities who demand worship, enforce submission, and maintain control through fear and deception. These myths, when read with discernment, appear less like cultural curiosities and more like fragments of a universal memory of archonic influence. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written records describe gods who resemble archons in their behavior. Figures like Enlil and Marduk demanded offerings obedience and submission from humanity. Enlil in particular is remembered as a stern and jealous deity who once sent a flood to annihilate humankind because of their noise and disobedience. Such stories parallel the Gnostic vision of the demiurge, an ignorant ruler punishing humanity for reasons rooted in envy or anger rather than divine justice. The Mesopotamian pantheon often divided humanity into classes of servants, workers, and kings who ruled by divine appointment, echoing the Archon's goal of maintaining strict hierarchies. From the beginning, worship of these gods was tied to systems of power that ensured humanity's labor and devotion served unseen masters. In Egypt, the tension between true divine wisdom and archonic deception appears in the myths of the afterlife. Egyptian religion taught that souls faced judgment in the Hall of Ma'at, where the heart was weighed against the feather of truth. While this ritual was framed as a divine test, many Gnostic interpretations see in it a foreshadowing of the Archon's attempts to control the passage of the soul. Certain gods like Set exemplify archonic traits: jealousy, violence, and manipulation. Set murdered his brother Osiris out of envy, an act that mirrors the Archon's envy of humanity's divine spark. At the same time, Egyptian esoteric wisdom, especially in its hermetic expressions, sought to guide the soul beyond these false rulers, suggesting that initiates were already aware of the need to bypass archonic powers guarding the gates of the afterlife. Greek mythology also preserves a strikingly similar narrative. The gods of Olympus, though majestic, were deeply flawed, driven by lust, jealousy, and hunger for power. Zeus himself, king of the gods, was often portrayed as a tyrant who ruled by thunder and fear. Kronos, his father, devoured his own children to prevent being overthrown. A grotesque act of control that aligns with the archonic obsession with domination and suppression of new life. Prometheus, the Titan who stole fire to give to humanity, can be seen as a Christ-like figure punished by the jealous gods for granting humans a spark of divine knowledge. These myths depict humanity caught between oppressive rulers above and liberators who defy them, a pattern that mirrors the Gnostic account of Archons versus the bringers of Gnosis. Even in pre-Columbian civilizations, echoes of archonic dynamics emerge. The Aztec gods, for instance, demanded endless human sacrifices to maintain cosmic balance. The idea that divine beings required blood to sustain themselves is a hallmark of archonic deception, feeding on fear, pain, and energy while masquerading as benevolent protectors. The sheer scale of ritual sacrifice in these cultures suggests an overwhelming influence of entities whose hunger was never sated, resembling the parasitic nature of Archons, described in esoteric traditions. What unites these diverse traditions is not their theological details, but their psychological and spiritual pattern. Across civilizations, humanity encountered beings who demanded loyalty, punished rebellion, and enforced systems of worship tied to political or social control. Kings often ruled by claiming divine authority from these gods, blending earthly power with spiritual manipulation. From Mesopotamian ziggurats to Egyptian temples to Greek oracles, the stage was set for humanity to serve intermediaries who claimed to represent the divine, but often acted in ways that betrayed ignorance, jealousy, and tyranny. These characteristics are consistent with the Gnostic portrayal of the Archons. The presence of Archon-like figures in so many cultures raises profound questions. Were these simply myths born of human imagination? Or did ancient peoples directly encounter the same parasitic rulers that Gnostics later named? Were the gods themselves Archons, or were they symbols through which people described encounters with unseen intelligences? While definitive answers may elude us, the similarities suggest a shared experience. Humanity has long felt the presence of hidden rulers who seek to dominate rather than liberate. By recognizing archonic influence in ancient civilizations, we begin to see human history in a new light. The grand empires that rose and fell may not have been guided solely by human ambition, but also by unseen hands, shaping events for their own purposes. The demand for worship, the cycles of war, the use of fear and sacrifice all point to the same reality that Archons have woven themselves into the fabric of civilization from its very beginning. Understanding this pattern allows us to reinterpret myth not as quaint story, but as encoded warning, teaching us to recognize the jailers of the soul, no matter what names they take. The connection between the Archons of Gnostic tradition and the fallen angels of biblical and apocryphal texts is one of the most fascinating bridges between esoteric Christianity and mainstream scripture. While the terminology differs, the underlying theme is remarkably similar: beings who were once part of a higher order, but turned away from divine harmony, seeking instead to dominate humanity. These fallen beings are not simply mischievous spirits. They are cosmic rebels who establish themselves as counterfeit rulers, feeding on human ignorance and fear. To understand the overlap, we must explore the Book of Enoch, the Genesis narrative, and later theological interpretations that cast these entities as corruptors of both flesh and spirit. The Book of Enoch, once revered among early Jewish and Christian communities, provides perhaps the clearest link. It tells the story of the Watcher's angels who descended to earth and took human women as wives, producing offspring known as the Nephilim. These giants were described as violent, corrupt, and destructive, spreading chaos across the earth. The Watchers themselves taught forbidden knowledge to humanity. Enchantments, weapon-making sorcery, and astrology distorted into tools of control. What emerges is a picture of celestial beings who, instead of guiding humanity toward God, exploited humanity for their own ends. This mirrors the archonic pattern: higher entities becoming false rulers, imposing domination rather than nurturing wisdom. In Genesis 6, the cryptic reference to the sons of God taking the daughters of men echoes the same story, though in fewer words. The result was a corruption of flesh and spirit so severe that it provoked the flood. Traditional interpretations often frame this as divine judgment upon human sin. Through a Gnostic lens, it can be seen as the exposure of archonic interference, fallen beings manipulating humanity at a genetic and spiritual level. The Nephilim, like the Archons' offspring, symbolize the contamination of the divine spark through hybridization, a mingling of higher and lower realms meant to trap the soul in corruption. Later biblical texts continue to emphasize the presence of these rebellious powers. Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 describe fallen figures cast out of heaven, often interpreted as Lucifer or Satan. These passages, when read alongside Gnostic writings, suggest that the Archons are not separate from the fallen angels, but another name for the same reality. Spiritual rebels who oppose the true God and set themselves up as counterfeit authorities. The New Testament affirms this worldview when it speaks of angels who did not keep their proper domain. Jude 6, bound in chains of darkness awaiting judgment. Though bound, their influence lingers in the systems of the world, perpetuating deception and oppression. One of the clearest similarities between Archons and fallen angels lies in their obsession with corrupting human potential. Both traditions emphasize that these beings are envious of humanity's unique connection to the divine. Gnostics taught that the Archons envied the divine spark within humans, while biblical texts describe Satan as the accuser constantly seeking to drag humanity down. The fallen angels, like the Archons, thrive by diverting human attention away from the source enslaving through fear, temptation, and deception. The overlap is too striking to dismiss. As coincidence, it suggests that both traditions were describing the same phenomenon in different language. In mystical traditions, the fallen angels are sometimes identified with the gods of pagan nations, the very deities that demanded sacrifice and worship. Deuteronomy 32:17 refers to Israel sacrificing to demons that were not God. Hinting at the same reality, the Gnostics would later expose false powers masquerading as divine. The Archons and fallen angels both receive worship that rightly belongs to the true God, siphoning energy from humanity to sustain their counterfeit dominion. This explains why Scripture so fiercely condemns idolatry, not merely because statues are empty, but because behind the idols lurk entities who enslave the soul. The fusion of the Archon and fallen angel traditions gives us a sobering perspective. Humanity is not merely misled by ideas, but actively manipulated by beings who chose rebellion over divine harmony. These beings implant lies, corrupt desires, and manipulate structures of power, much as the Watchers corrupted early humanity with forbidden knowledge. Their strategies have not changed. They still lure humanity into distraction, fear, and worship of false authorities. What changes is only the mask they wear, ancient gods. Angelic rebels, or modern ideologies that promise salvation while concealing chains. To recognize the connection between Archons and fallen angels is to see a unity in the world's spiritual warnings. Whether called Archons Watchers, Nephilim, or demons, these are the same counterfeit rulers whose goal is to keep humanity blind to its true origin. They are the cosmic jailers, the parasites of spirit, who cannot create, but only corrupt. And yet, even within this grim picture, hope remains. For just as Christ is said to have disarmed principalities and powers, so too can awakened humanity expose and transcend the Archons, breaking free from the bondage of fallen rulers. The story of fallen angels reminds us that their dominion is temporary, their fate already sealed, and their power ultimately broken by the light of the true source. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, the idea of cosmic rulers opposing humanity was not foreign. The writings of Paul and other apostles, as we have seen, hinted at principalities and powers that warred against the faithful. But alongside the communities that later developed into Orthodox Christianity, there were other groups often called Gnostics, who spoke more openly and directly about the Archons. For them, the Archons were not abstract metaphors, but real entities, cosmic jailers, who worked to keep souls enslaved within a counterfeit world. Early Christianity was therefore not a unified front, but a battlefield of interpretations, and the Archon question lay at the center of that struggle. The Gnostic Christians viewed Christ's mission as a direct confrontation with the Archons. They saw him not simply as a teacher of morality or a sacrificial lamb, but as a revealer of hidden truth. Christ descended from the higher realms to awaken humanity to its true origin and to expose the Archons for what they were: blind, envious rulers clinging to illegitimate authority. The crucifixion in this view was not merely a tragic death, but the moment when the Archons revealed their hatred for the divine light. Believing they could extinguish him, they crucified the Lord of Glory, not realizing that his resurrection would shatter their illusion of power. This interpretation gave early Gnostic Christians a radical lens. Salvation was liberation from the Archon's prison, and gnosis knowledge of the true source was the key. This perspective, however, clashed with the emerging orthodoxy. Bishops and church leaders, who sought to unify the Christian faith under clear doctrines, considered Gnostic teachings too dangerous. To say that the God of the Old Testament was not the true God, but the demiurge, or to suggest that earthly rulers were puppets of cosmic jailers, threatened both theological authority and political order. The Roman Empire, which eventually embraced Christianity, relied upon religious unity to maintain control. Gnostic texts, with their emphasis on inner knowledge and rejection of false authority, undermined that unity. It is little wonder, then, that many of these texts were suppressed, labeled heretical, and eventually hidden away, only to resurface centuries later. Nag Hammadi. Among the writings recovered, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, and the Hypostasis of the Archons, we glimpse how widespread these ideas were. The Hypostasis of the Archons, in particular, interprets Genesis not as a tale of divine creation, but as a revelation of archonic deception. The serpent in Eden is not the villain, but the liberator, offering humanity the knowledge of good and evil that the Archons tried to withhold. The jealous God who forbids eating from the tree is none other than the demiurge, terrified that humanity will awaken to its divine potential. Such reinterpretations were revolutionary and scandalous, flipping the conventional narrative upside down. For Orthodox leaders, they could not be tolerated, for they undermined the entire framework of authority upon which both church and empire were built. The conflict between Gnostics and Orthodox Christians was not simply theological, but existential. The Gnostics warned that worshiping the false god was equivalent to serving the Archons, while the Orthodox insisted on obedience to the Creator of heaven and earth, as revealed in Scripture. Both groups used the same texts, Genesis, Paul's letters, the words of Jesus, but interpreted them radically differently. For one, the Old Testament God was the demiurge, jealous and blind. For the other, he was the Father of Christ, worthy of worship. For one, the serpent was a bringer of knowledge. For the other, the serpent was Satan, the deceiver. These divergent readings show how early Christianity was a contested field, and the Archon concept lay at the heart of its fractures. Yet even as the Gnostic texts were suppressed, hints of their worldview persisted. The emphasis in Paul's letters on freedom from the elements of the world and the triumph of Christ over principalities and powers continued to resonate. The Church incorporated language of spiritual warfare, though it stripped away the radical critique of cosmic rulers as counterfeit authorities. By reframing the Archons as demons or Satan's minions rather than rival gods, the Orthodox Church maintained the urgency of vigilance while consolidating its own legitimacy. In this way, the Archon concept was never entirely erased, but reshaped its sharper edges, dulled its revolutionary potential contained. The presence of Archons in early Christianity reveals how close the faith once stood to a radical awakening. Had the Gnostic vision prevailed, Christianity might have emphasized inner knowledge, liberation from counterfeit rulers, and the discernment of divine truth within. Instead, the Orthodox path emphasized obedience hierarchy and submission to institutional authority. But with the rediscovery of Gnostic texts, we now see that the story of early Christianity was far more complex than the official version suggests. The Archons, once condemned to silence, speak again through these writings, reminding us that from the very beginning, the struggle for truth was a struggle against spiritual jailers hiding behind the veil of religion. Among the most unsettling claims in Gnostic teaching is the idea that the Archons do not only control society, religion, and the mind, but also the cycle of death and rebirth itself. According to these teachings, the Archons are jailers not merely of bodies, but of souls operating a system that keeps humanity recycling endlessly through the material world, never remembering its true origin. This is often referred to as the soul trap, a mechanism that ensures the divine spark within humanity remains bound to the counterfeit creation feeding the Archons with energy, while preventing souls from escaping to the higher realms of the source. The Nag Hammadi texts describe the Archons as gatekeepers stationed between the earthly realm and the higher heavens. When a soul departs from the body, it must pass through their dominion. Here, the Archons interrogate, deceive, or attempt to lure the soul back into the cycle of reincarnation. They may appear as beings of light, presenting themselves as guides, or even as the true God, but their aim is to redirect the soul into another material life. This false light is one of their most dangerous tools, for it convinces souls that they are entering heaven, when in fact, they are returning to the Archon's prison. The Apocryphon of John and related texts warn that only souls who possess gnosis, true knowledge of their divine origin, can see through these illusions and ascend beyond the archonic system. This concept resonates with numerous other traditions. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo Thodol, Tibetan Book of the Dead warns of illusions that appear to the soul after death, which if misunderstood, lead to rebirth. In ancient Egyptian beliefs, the soul faced trials and judgments that determined its fate, many of which can be seen as parallels to archonic tests. Even in Christian apocryphal works, such as the Ascension of Isaiah, there are depictions of hostile powers in the heavens attempting to prevent the soul from rising. Across cultures, there is a recurring motif. The journey of the soul after death is fraught with deception, and discernment is the key to liberation. The idea of a soul trap also helps explain why the Archons invest so heavily in fostering ignorance during life. If humans die without awareness of their true nature, they are easily ensnared in the afterlife. They are lured by familiar images, family members, religious figures, comforting visions, presented by the Archons to ensure compliance. The soul desiring rest embraces these illusions and is recycled into another body, forgetting everything it learned before. Thus, ignorance perpetuates the cycle. The Archons depend on this forgetfulness to sustain their dominion, for awakened souls who carry gnosis can bypass their traps and ascend to the source. Even the Christian tradition, though stripped of explicit Gnostic language, contains hints of this battle at death. Paul writes of Christ delivering humanity from the power of death and the rulers of this age. The victory of Christ over death can be read as a victory over the Archons' control of the soul cycle. In Orthodox Christianity, salvation means eternal life in heaven rather than endless reincarnation. But the underlying idea is similar. The true God liberates the soul from powers that seek to bind it. The resurrection of Christ, then, is not only a historical event, but also a metaphysical triumph demonstrating that the Archons cannot ultimately imprison the divine light. Modern interpretations of the soul trap idea have gained attention in near-death experience research. Some individuals report encounters with a light that invites them to return or enter another life. While many interpret this as divine, some traditions suggest it may represent the archonic false light. If true, then discernment at the moment of death is crucial. The question is whether one follows appearances or penetrates deeper to the source beyond the Archon's illusions. This controversial but compelling idea underscores the seriousness of spiritual preparation, not merely moral behavior, but conscious awakening to one's divine origin. If the Archons truly operate a soul trap, then the stakes of human life are immense. Our daily struggles are not only about surviving within society or resisting temptation, but about preparing the soul for its ultimate test. Awakening, remembering, and cultivating inner knowledge are not luxuries, but necessities. For at the moment of death, the Archons will attempt their final deception, and only those who see through the illusion will escape. This teaching reframes existence itself. Life becomes a school for liberation, and death is not an end but a crossing where discernment determines destiny. The soul trap may sound frightening, but within it lies profound hope. For if humanity can awaken, the Archons lose their grip. They cannot extinguish the divine spark. They can only obscure it. Once the soul recognizes its true light and refuses the counterfeit offers, it passes beyond their reach. This is the promise of gnosis. The good news hidden beneath layers of suppression. The prison has a key, and that key is within us. If we look beyond the Gnostic scriptures and Christian writings, we find that the concept of Archons has uncanny parallels in both Jewish and Islamic mystical traditions. While these traditions may not use the same terminology, the underlying themes, cosmic rulers, deceptive powers, and forces that veil humanity from the true God, appear again and again. By examining Jewish mysticism's Qliphoth and Islamic teachings about the jinn, we begin to see that the Archon concept is not isolated to one worldview, but echoes across Abrahamic faiths in subtle but striking ways. In Jewish Kabbalistic thought, there exists a concept known as the Qliphoth, sometimes translated as husks or shells. These are the distorted remnants of creation unbalanced vessels that hold fragments of divine energy but pervert them into forms of corruption. The Qliphoth are often described as demonic forces or realms of impurity that oppose the divine order of the Sephiroth, the sacred tree of life. Like the Archons, they are parasitic in nature, feeding off divine sparks, but incapable of creating true light themselves. Their role is to obstruct, to confuse, and to trap the soul in illusion and impurity. In this way, the Qliphoth can be seen as another lens on the archonic system. Counterfeit structures that mimic divinity while enslaving humanity in shadows. The Kabbalistic texts also speak of Samael, sometimes called the poison of God, who presides over these husks. Samael is depicted as an accuser-tempter and angel of death, an echo of the demiurge's arrogant and destructive qualities. He is often linked with Lilith, a figure who embodies deception and seduction. Together, they represent forces that lure humanity into error, draining life energy while keeping souls bound to cycles of impurity, just as the Gnostics warned against mistaking the demiurge for the true God. Kabbalists warned of the danger of confusing these husks for divine reality. Only those who could pierce the illusion and ascend through the Sephiroth could reach union with the Ein Sof, the limitless God, beyond all forms. In Islamic tradition, the parallels emerge most clearly in the teachings about the jinn. The Quran describes the jinn as beings made of smokeless fire, invisible to human eyes, but capable of influencing human thoughts and actions. While not all jinn are considered evil, many are described as deceptive and manipulative, leading humanity away from the path of God. The Quran warns that some jinn whisper into the hearts of men, planting suggestions of fear, pride, and rebellion. This description resonates strongly with the Gnostic portrayal of the Archons, implanting false thoughts and distorting human perception. Both traditions emphasize the need for vigilance prayer and discernment to protect oneself from these unseen forces. Islam also speaks of Iblis, the great deceiver who refused to bow to Adam and was cast out of heaven. His arrogance and rebellion against God echo the arrogance of the demiurge, who claimed authority over humanity out of jealousy for the divine spark. Iblis and his legions work to distract humanity from remembrance of God Dikr, keeping people ensnared in worldly illusions. Here again, we see the archonic pattern envy of humanity's special connection to God, combined with a strategy of deception and distraction to prevent souls from awakening. What is striking is that both Jewish and Islamic mysticism maintain a dual view of these forces. They are real and dangerous, yet ultimately subordinate to the true God. The Qliphoth and the jinn may ensnare, but they are not eternal. They exist within the cosmic drama as challenges to be overcome, tests of humanity's discernment and devotion. This is precisely what the Gnostics also taught the Archons are powerful within their limited realm, but powerless against the awakened soul that remembers its origin. By recognizing these parallels, we can see that the idea of spiritual jailers is not confined to fringe esotericism, but is deeply embedded in the mystical currents of the great Abrahamic faiths. The Archons, Qliphoth, jinn, and fallen angels all describe a reality in which humanity is caught between higher truth and deceptive forces. The path of liberation, whether called gnosis, Kabbalistic ascent, or surrender to Allah, requires piercing through illusion and refusing to bow to counterfeit rulers. Ultimately, Jewish and Islamic mysticism confirm what the Gnostics insisted: humanity's struggle is not merely earthly, but cosmic. Not merely moral, but metaphysical. The real battle is not only against injustice in the world, but against unseen powers that feed on fear, ignorance, and forgetfulness. By studying these traditions together, we begin to recognize that the archonic system has been known across cultures, and that liberation from it has always been the central aim of authentic spiritual practice. As the centuries passed, the explicit language of Gnosticism faded from mainstream awareness, yet the core ideas of Archons continued to reappear under new names. In modern times, scholars, psychologists, and spiritual seekers have revisited these ancient concepts, reframing them in ways that speak to contemporary audiences. From Carl Jung's psychological archetypes to UFO and alien abduction theories, from conspiracy narratives about hidden elites to spiritual teachings about psychic parasites, the Archons have been reborn in multiple guises. The consistency of these interpretations suggests that humanity still senses the presence of hidden rulers, shaping our perception and destiny, even if the vocabulary has shifted. Carl Jung, the famed depth psychologist, did not use the term archons explicitly, yet his description of psychic parasites mirrors the Gnostic vision with uncanny precision. Jung observed that human beings are often dominated by autonomous complexes within the psyche clusters of thought and emotion that behave like independent personalities. These complexes can hijack the mind, distort perception, and drive destructive behavior, almost as if the individual were possessed. Jung also described the concept of the shadow, the repressed part of the psyche that, if unacknowledged, can project itself onto the world, creating cycles of fear and division. To the Gnostic ear, these insights sound like a psychological restatement of archonic influence forces that implant intrusive thoughts, distort human behavior, and feed off unacknowledged ignorance. In Jung's framework, the Archons are less alien entities and more psychic intruders, yet the effect is the same loss of sovereignty over the mind. In the 20th century, the rise of UFO phenomena and alien abduction reports gave the Archon concept a new vocabulary. Writers such as John Keel and Jacques Vallée suggested that the entities encountered in such experiences may not be extraterrestrial in the conventional sense, but interdimensional beings who manipulate human perception. Abductees often report encounters with cold mechanical entities, devoid of empathy, obsessed with control and experimentation. These descriptions resonate with Gnostic portrayals of Archons as soulless and parasitic. Some modern researchers, like John Lamb Lash, have explicitly drawn connections between the Archons of the Nag Hammadi texts and the gray aliens of UFO lore. Whether literal or symbolic, these accounts reinforce the idea of hidden beings feeding on human fear and ignorance while maintaining secrecy about their true nature. Conspiracy theories also echo the Archon narrative, though often without awareness of its ancient roots. Ideas of a hidden cabal controlling governments, economies, and media align with the Gnostic warning that counterfeit rulers govern the world through deception. While these modern narratives often focus on human elites, the underlying sense is the same, that visible authority is only a mask for unseen powers pulling the strings. From a Gnostic perspective, these hidden rulers may be both human and archonic, with human agents serving as vehicles for the deeper parasitic system. Whether or not one accepts every conspiracy claim, the resonance with the Archon archetype cannot be ignored. Spiritual teachers in the modern era have also reframed the Archon concept in terms of energy. They describe parasitic entities that attach to individuals, draining vitality through negative emotions, addictions, or unresolved trauma. These beings thrive in environments of fear and division, feeding on the energy that humans release when trapped in cycles of suffering. In New Age and shamanic traditions, such entities are often called energy vampires or dark attachments, but their role matches the Archons precisely to distract the soul from awakening and to perpetuate ignorance. Practices of cleansing meditation and conscious awareness are presented as defenses against such intrusions, echoing the ancient call to vigilance and gnosis. Even secular culture reflects archonic themes. The film The Matrix portrays a false reality generated by parasitic machines that enslave humanity while feeding on its life force. The Wachowski siblings, whether consciously or unconsciously, tapped into the very essence of Gnostic cosmology. The idea that the world is a simulation created by hostile powers is nothing new. It is a modern retelling of the Archon story. Similarly, dystopian literature and media often depict hidden systems of control, where freedom is an illusion and rebellion requires awakening to a deeper truth. These narratives captivate audiences precisely because they resonate with a buried awareness that our world may not be what it seems. Modern interpretations of the Archons therefore bridge psychology, spirituality, and culture. Whether understood as psychic complexes, alien intelligences, parasitic energies, or systemic deceptions, the pattern remains consistent. Humanity is influenced by forces that do not serve its best interests, forces that seek to keep the divine spark dormant. Yet the very persistence of these interpretations also reveals humanity's resilience. Across psychology, art, and spiritual practice, we see attempts to expose, name, and resist the counterfeit rulers. The Archons may change their masks, but recognition of their presence continues to surface, ensuring that their secrecy is never complete. In our modern world, the idea of Archons finds one of its clearest expressions in what many now call the Matrix control system. The Gnostics warned that the Archons construct a counterfeit reality, an elaborate illusion designed to keep humanity blind to its true origins. This is not so different from the modern concept of a digital simulation, in which humanity unknowingly lives inside a program generated by higher intelligences. Both visions emphasize the same point. The prison is not made of iron, but of perception itself. To awaken is not to escape physically, but to see through the deception, realizing that the rules of the game are not ultimate truths, but imposed structures. The Matrix control system operates by shaping belief and perception. Just as Archons implant false thoughts, the system surrounds individuals with narratives that define what is real, what is possible, and what is acceptable. Education, media, religion, and even science can be harnessed to maintain the illusion, teaching people to accept limitations without questioning them. For instance, the belief that human beings are nothing more than biological machines with no spiritual dimension reflects an archonic narrative. It strips humanity of its divine spark and reduces it to a controllable resource. When a society accepts this worldview, its members become easier to manage, for they no longer recognize their own higher potential. Technology itself can serve as both metaphor and mechanism for this system. On one hand, digital media provides endless distractions that keep people from deep reflection, mirroring the Archon's tactic of flooding consciousness with triviality. On the other hand, surveillance technology's data collection and algorithmic control replicate the archonic obsession with monitoring and manipulating humanity. Every click, every choice, every preference is tracked and used to shape future behavior. The result is a subtle but powerful form of control that keeps individuals locked within pre-programmed loops, much like the Archon's manipulation of human psychology. What looks like freedom of choice is often only a set of pre-selected options designed to guide the soul deeper into the illusion. Entertainment further reveals the fingerprints of the Matrix system. While stories of rebellion, liberation, and awakening dominate popular culture, they often remain confined to fiction, offering catharsis without transformation. Films like The Matrix itself dramatize the very prison humanity inhabits, yet audiences often leave the theater entertained rather than awakened. This is another layer of control. Even the narratives that expose the system can be absorbed into the system, functioning as diversions rather than catalysts. The Archons excel at this strategy, allowing glimpses of truth, but ensuring those glimpses are neutralized by turning them into spectacle or distraction. Economics, too, reflects the archonic structure of the Matrix. Endless cycles of debt, labor, and consumption keep humanity enslaved to material concerns. People spend their lives chasing money, status, and possessions, rarely pausing to question whether these pursuits serve their true nature. The Archons ensure that the system perpetuates scarcity and competition, keeping individuals too preoccupied with survival to contemplate freedom. In this way, the Matrix is not only technological, but economic, ensuring that the vast majority of humanity remains focused on the material realm, feeding energy into the system, while forgetting its spiritual origin. Perhaps the most insidious feature of the Matrix control system is its self-defense mechanism. Whenever individuals begin to awaken questioning the illusions around them, the system responds with ridicule, suppression, or redirection. Whistleblowers are silenced. Seekers are branded as crazy, and truths are buried beneath floods of misinformation. The Archons cannot allow awakening to spread unchecked, so they use society itself as a weapon against those who see too clearly. Family, friends, and institutions may all unconsciously defend the system, shaming those who threaten its stability. This mirrors the way Archons implant false thoughts in individuals. Resistance often comes not through open battle, but through subtle undermining of confidence and clarity. Yet even within this grim vision, hope shines through. Just as Neo in the Matrix awakens to his power, so too can humanity realize that the prison is not unbreakable. The Gnostics taught that knowledge gnosis dissolves the Archons' illusions. Once a soul recognizes the system for what it is, the rules no longer bind in the same way. Choices become freer, perception expands, and the divine spark begins to shine through the cracks of the counterfeit world. The Matrix, like the Archons, thrives only when its prisoners believe in its authority. The moment belief falters, its control weakens. To speak of Archons and the Matrix together is to recognize that ancient and modern symbols describe the same reality. Whether imagined as mechanical parasites in the psyche or as computer programs shaping society, the core idea is consistent. Humanity is trapped within a manufactured reality, maintained by rulers who envy the divine light. Awakening requires courage, discernment, and the refusal to accept appearances at face value. The Matrix is not simply a movie, nor are the Archons merely myth. They are descriptions of the same system that seeks to enslave the soul. The task of the seeker is to see through the illusion and reclaim the freedom that has always belonged to them. If the Archons are real, their influence should not be confined to ancient texts or mythological symbols. It should be observable in the patterns of our modern world. Indeed, when we look closely at society today, we see signs of their fingerprints everywhere. Systems of division, cultures of fear, and structures that drain human energy rather than uplift it. These signs are not limited to religion or politics, but span every corner of life, from technology and economics to psychology and personal relationships. The Archons' strategies remain the same as in antiquity, but the masks they wear adapt to the times. One of the clearest signs of Archonic influence is the culture of fear that dominates global consciousness. News media thrives on stories of crisis, violence, and disaster, ensuring that people remain anxious about the future. Governments amplify these fears through policies that emphasize security surveillance and control, often justifying extreme measures in the name of safety. This atmosphere mirrors the Archons' oldest strategy to keep humanity paralyzed by fear, so that discernment is clouded and awakening is delayed. When people live in a constant state of anxiety, they are more likely to submit to authority and less likely to question the structures around them. Fear, in this sense, is both the product and the food of Archonic systems. The food of another sign is the normalization of division. The Archons thrive on separation, and in our time, humanity is more fragmented than ever. Racial, political, religious, and cultural divides are emphasized rather than healed, creating endless conflict. Social media algorithms exacerbate this by feeding users content that reinforces their biases, ensuring that people live in echo chambers. Families, communities, and nations turn against one another, believing they are fighting for truth, while in reality, they are being manipulated by deeper forces. The Archons know that a divided humanity cannot unite to challenge their dominion, so they invest in amplifying every difference until unity seems impossible. Materialism also reveals their presence. Consumer culture convinces people that happiness lies in possession status and constant acquisition. Advertising manipulates desires, creating a cycle of craving that never satisfies. This endless pursuit of material goods mirrors the archonic system of distraction. Souls are kept so busy chasing illusions that they forget their true nature. Even when individuals achieve wealth or recognition, they often feel empty, for what they have attained is not aligned with the divine spark. The Archons exploit this emptiness, offering new illusions to chase, ensuring the cycle continues. In technology, the Archons' influence can be seen in the shift from tools of empowerment to tools of control. While technology has the potential to liberate in practice, it often enslaves. Social media reduces human attention spans, fuels envy and comparison, and floods the mind with trivial content. Surveillance technologies track movements, purchases, and even emotions, creating a society where privacy is nearly extinct. Artificial intelligence, though, powerful risks becoming another layer of archonic imitation machines that mimic intelligence without possessing spirit. In this technological landscape, humanity risks merging with the very mechanical qualities that define the Archons themselves, losing touch with the living soul in exchange for efficiency and convenience. The influence extends even into personal psychology. Rates of depression, anxiety, and alienation continue to rise despite material progress. People report feeling disconnected from meaning, trapped in cycles of stress, or plagued by intrusive thoughts. These conditions reflect precisely the strategies described by the Gnostics. False thoughts implanted by archonic forces. Illusions of separation that prevent people from experiencing unity with the divine. Pharmaceutical industries often provide temporary relief, but rarely address the root problem, the loss of connection to the inner spark. The persistence of such widespread psychological suffering suggests a deeper, unseen influence at work. Religion itself is not exempt. In many cases, religious institutions that claim to guide humanity toward God end up reinforcing archonic structures. When worship is directed toward a jealous, punishing deity rather than the infinite source of love, people unknowingly give their devotion to the counterfeit god, the demiurge. When institutions demand obedience to hierarchy rather than cultivating inner knowledge, they mirror the very qualities of archonic rule. The irony is that faith meant to liberate the soul can, when distorted, become one of the strongest prisons, ensuring that seekers never move beyond the illusion. Yet recognizing these signs is not a cause for despair, but for vigilance. The very fact that archonic influence can be identified shows that the veil is thinning. People across the world are awakening, questioning narratives, and seeking deeper truths. Every moment of discernment, every act of unity, every rejection of fear weakens the hold of the Archons. Their power depends on invisibility, and once exposed, their strategies begin to crumble. To see the signs of archonic influence in today's world is to be reminded that the battle is ongoing, but not hopeless. Humanity's awakening is the greatest threat to their dominion, and it is already underway. If the Archons are indeed rulers of deception, their greatest fear is not war or rebellion in the ordinary sense, but awakening. The Gnostic texts remind us again and again that the Archons cannot truly destroy the divine spark within humanity, for that spark belongs to the eternal source. What they can do is obscure it, confuse it, and distract it. Thus, the most effective resistance humanity can mount is not through violence or external overthrow, but through inner remembrance, knowledge, and discernment. To resist the Archons is to cultivate a way of life that refuses fear, rejects illusion, and chooses alignment with the higher truth beyond their counterfeit world. The first act of resistance is knowledge gnosis. The Archons thrive in ignorance. Their power is greatest when humanity forgets its true origin. When a person realizes that their essence is not defined by matter, fear, or external authority, but by the eternal light within, the Archons lose their grip. Gnosis does not mean intellectual information, but direct inner knowing, a recognition of the spark that connects each soul to the infinite source. Ancient Gnostic teachers described this awakening as remembering like a sleeper, suddenly realizing they are dreaming. In that moment of clarity, the dream no longer has absolute power, and the Archon's illusions collapse. Second resistance requires discernment, because the Archons excel at creating counterfeits. False light, false prophets, false freedoms. Humans must learn to distinguish the genuine from the imitation. This is why self-knowledge is so crucial. When you know your own inner voice, it becomes easier to recognize when thoughts, fears, or desires are not truly yours, but intrusions. Discernment also applies to the outer world. Not every authority that claims divine sanction is legitimate. Not every tradition that demands obedience leads to truth. By practicing discernment, humanity gradually strips away archonic disguises, leaving them exposed as hollow imposters. Third resistance comes through love. While the Archons feed on fear and division, love is the frequency they cannot mimic or consume. Love expands. The heart unites individuals and reminds humanity of its divine nature. In this sense, acts of compassion, forgiveness, and unity are not merely moral choices, but weapons of liberation. Every time fear is met with love, the archonic system loses fuel. This is why Christ's teaching to love even one's enemies is not naive, but profoundly revolutionary. It bypasses the Archon's traps and taps into a power they cannot counterfeit. Love reveals the higher reality of the source, a reality in which the Archons have no place. Another form of resistance is inner sovereignty. The Archons thrive on external authority structures, convincing people that salvation or worth can only come from outside themselves. True resistance is reclaiming the authority of the inner, divine spark. This does not mean rejecting all guidance or community, but it does mean refusing to surrender ultimate power to counterfeit rulers. Prayer, meditation, and contemplation become acts of rebellion when they center the soul in direct communion with the source, bypassing the false mediators. By strengthening inner sovereignty, individuals become less susceptible to manipulation and more capable of standing in truth, even when surrounded by illusion. Community also plays a crucial role in resisting the Archons. Isolation makes individuals vulnerable, while genuine fellowship strengthens resilience. When groups gather to share knowledge, encourage discernment, and embody love, they create pockets of light that disrupt archonic influence. Historically, Gnostic communities saw themselves as small seeds of liberation in a world dominated by counterfeit powers. Today, spiritual seekers who build networks of trust and truth continue this legacy, offering one another refuge from the flood of deception. Together they model a way of being that resists fear, honors freedom, and points toward the higher source. Finally, humanity resists the Archons by remembering destiny. The Gnostics insisted that the Archons' dominion is temporary, confined to this age, and doomed to end. To live with this perspective is itself resistance, for it prevents despair. Even when the world appears dark and the systems of control seem overwhelming, the knowledge that their power is not eternal gives strength. Hope becomes a form of rebellion, faith a shield, and persistence a victory. In this way, resistance is not only about rejecting deception, but about embodying the truth of what will ultimately triumph, the eternal light of the source. The Archons may continue their strategies of fear, ignorance, and control, but they cannot extinguish the spark that burns within humanity. By cultivating knowledge, discernment, love, sovereignty, community, and hope, humanity resists their dominion day by day. The struggle is ongoing, but every awakened soul is a breach in the Archon's prison, a reminder that their reign is fragile. Resistance, then, is not merely survival, it is the quiet but unstoppable revolution of awakening. For the Gnostics and for many early Christians as well, the coming of Christ was not only about forgiveness of sins or the promise of heaven after death. It was a direct intervention into the cosmic drama between humanity and the Archons. Christ's role was not simply that of a moral teacher, but of a liberator, one who descended into the counterfeit world to expose the false rulers and reveal the pathway back to the true source. When we read Scripture with this lens, the mission of Christ takes on a far more revolutionary dimension. He came to confront and overcome the Archons, who sought to keep humanity imprisoned. The Gospels themselves hint at this cosmic battle. In the wilderness, Christ is tempted by Satan, who offers him all the kingdoms of the world in exchange for worship. This story is often interpreted as a personal trial, but on a deeper level, it reveals the archonic system. The kingdoms of the world, with their hierarchies, violence, and exploitation, belong not to God, but to the counterfeit rulers. Satan's offer demonstrates that earthly authority lies under the dominion of these powers. Christ's refusal shows that his mission is not to rule within their system, but to expose and transcend it. He did not come to affirm the world as it is, but to declare that its rulers stand judged. Throughout his ministry, Christ confronted demons, casting them out of afflicted individuals. These encounters, while described as exorcisms, can also be read as symbolic victories over archonic influence. Each healing was not just a medical miracle, but a disruption of the counterfeit order. In silencing the demons, Christ revealed his authority over the very beings who sought to enslave humanity. His power did not come from ritual or hierarchy, but from his direct connection to the Source, the Father of Light. In every confrontation, the message was clear. The Archons may hold sway over the world, but they have no authority over the divine spark within. Paul's letters further illuminate this theme. In Colossians 2:13, he declares that Christ disarmed the principalities and powers and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. This is cosmic language. The crucifixion was not merely a political execution, but the moment when the Archons unleashed their hatred against the embodiment of divine light. Believing they could extinguish him, they crucified Christ. But in doing so, they revealed their impotence. His resurrection shattered the illusion of their dominion, proving that death itself, the Archon's ultimate weapon, could not contain the divine spark. The cross, far from being a defeat, became the very stage where the counterfeit rulers were exposed and humiliated. The Gospel of John frames Christ's mission in terms of light and darkness. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In Gnostic interpretation, the darkness is the archonic realm, the counterfeit world woven of ignorance and fear. The light is Christ descending from the higher pleroma to awaken the sparks scattered within humanity. His words, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," directly address the Archons' primary weapon, deception. Freedom comes not through submission to external law, but through gnosis, the inner recognition of truth that dissolves illusion. Christ's role, then, is not only to teach, but to awaken, to ignite the remembrance that humanity's origin lies beyond the counterfeit rulers. The role of Christ against the Archons also explains why his message was so threatening to both religious and political authorities. By challenging the legitimacy of their systems, he revealed that their power was built upon illusion. When he declared that the kingdom of God was within, he undermined both the archonic system and its earthly reflections. If humanity carries the divine spark within, then no external ruler, spiritual or political, can claim ultimate authority. This teaching was revolutionary then, and it remains revolutionary today. For believers, the presence of Christ is not confined to history, but continues as a living reality. The Gnostics taught that Christ came as the Logos, the divine word that penetrates the archonic veil. His role is ongoing, guiding souls past the false lights of the counterfeit rulers into the fullness of the source. Every act of remembrance, every choice for truth over illusion is an extension of Christ's victory. By aligning with him, humanity participates in the ongoing dismantling of the archonic system. Thus, Christ's role against the Archons is both cosmic and personal. He exposed their illusions on the grand stage of history, but he also empowers each soul to resist them within. His life, death, and resurrection were not abstract theological events, but demonstrations of how to confront and transcend the counterfeit rulers. For the Archons, he remains the great threat, the embodiment of light. They cannot extinguish the revealer of truth they cannot suppress, and the liberator of souls who refuse to remain prisoners in their counterfeit world. The ultimate destiny of the Archons, according to both Gnostic texts and biblical prophecy, is not endless dominion, but inevitable defeat. Their reign may appear overwhelming in the present age, but their power is limited, their days numbered, and their illusions destined to collapse before the light of truth. The apocalypse, literally meaning unveiling, is not merely the end of the world in fire and chaos, but the revelation of reality as it truly is. To unveil is to strip away the Archons' disguises, to expose the counterfeit structures they have built, and to reveal the sovereignty of the true source. This is why the Archons dread the apocalypse, because it marks the moment when humanity sees through them and refuses to submit any longer. The Book of Revelation, though often interpreted as a literal prediction of future disasters, can also be read as a symbolic narrative of the Archons' defeat. The beast, the dragon, and Babylon the Great all embody the qualities of archonic power: deception, domination, and the seduction of materialism. The beast enforces worship of false authority. The dragon wages war against the saints, and Babylon intoxicates the nations with her illusions of wealth and pleasure. Together, they represent the counterfeit world order that mirrors the archonic system described in Gnostic writings. Yet Revelation is clear: these powers are judged, overthrown, and cast down. Their destruction is not gradual, but sudden, as if the entire edifice of illusion collapses once the light of truth shines upon it. For the Gnostics, the apocalypse was not only a future event, but an ongoing reality. Each act of awakening, each moment of gnosis was a personal apocalypse, a revelation that stripped the Archons of their influence. At the collective level, they foresaw a time when humanity as a whole would awaken, when the veil of ignorance would be lifted from the world, and the counterfeit rulers would no longer be able to deceive. This cosmic unveiling aligns with the biblical promise that Christ will return with the shout of an archangel and with the trumpet of God, not to destroy creation, but to liberate it from the powers that enslave. The apocalypse, then, is liberation, the breaking of chains, and the revelation of humanity's true inheritance. The imagery of judgment in Scripture also reflects this defeat. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15:24 that Christ will hand over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. These are not merely earthly rulers, but the archonic authorities who have claimed illegitimate control. The victory of Christ is the dismantling of their system, the unmasking of their counterfeit order, and the restoration of creation to its true harmony. What the Archons have twisted the apocalypse will set straight. What they have hidden the apocalypse will reveal. Signs of this unveiling are already visible in our time. More people are questioning official narratives, exposing corruption, and seeking spiritual truths beyond institutional religion. The rise of global communication has made it harder for deception to remain concealed. While the Archons adapt by flooding humanity with disinformation and distraction, the very act of seeking truth weakens their grip. The apocalypse is not only cataclysm, but awakening and acceleration of discernment that reveals how much of the world's systems are built on lies. In this sense, the unveiling has already begun, and the Archons tremble because their dominion depends entirely on secrecy. The Gnostics taught that the Archons feed on fear, but the apocalypse will end their feast. As humanity awakens to its true nature, fear gives way to courage, ignorance to knowledge, division to unity. The Archons cannot survive in such an atmosphere, for their tools become useless. Revelation's promise of a new heaven and new earth can be seen as symbolic of this transformation, a reality no longer structured by counterfeit rulers, but aligned with the eternal source. The city of God, shining with light, represents the soul free of deception, the collective destiny of humanity restored to truth. The defeat of the Archons is not only certain, but already underway. Every moment of awakening, every act of love, every rejection of illusion is a step toward their downfall. Their counterfeit kingdom may roar loudly, but it is hollow, and its collapse will be sudden. The apocalypse is not humanity's doom, but the Archons' doom. The unveiling that reveals the jailers were never legitimate rulers at all. For those who cling to truth, the end of the Archons is not to be feared, but embraced. For it marks the dawn of true freedom. If the Archons represent the counterfeit rulers of this age, then their eventual defeat opens the door to a future that humanity can scarcely imagine. The Gnostics and mystics across cultures did not merely warn of oppression. They also held out visions of liberation, a destiny in which the soul is no longer bound to cycles of ignorance, fear, and illusion. To contemplate the future beyond the Archons is to envision what life might look like when humanity awakens fully to its divine spark, when the counterfeit world collapses, and when alignment with the source becomes the foundation of existence. Such a vision is not mere fantasy, but a profound invitation. The future of freedom depends on the choices humanity makes today. The first aspect of this future is inner sovereignty. Once the Archons are unmasked, humanity can no longer be deceived by external authorities masquerading as divine. Instead of bowing to systems of fear, individuals will recognize the divine spark within and live from that center. This does not mean chaos or lawlessness. Rather, it means order, grounded in truth, compassion, and inner wisdom rather than imposed hierarchies. People will no longer seek salvation from outside rulers, but will cultivate direct communion with the source. The collapse of archonic authority thus marks the rise of true spiritual maturity. Humanity no longer as children under guardians, but as awakened beings responsible for their own destiny. Another aspect is the restoration of unity. The Archons thrive on division between nations, races, religions, and even within the self. Beyond their influence, these false boundaries dissolve. Humanity begins to see itself not as fragmented tribes, but as one family, each soul carrying the same divine essence. This unity does not erase diversity, but celebrates it as expressions of the one source. Conflicts fueled by envy, greed, and fear lose their power, for the underlying illusions are exposed. The future beyond the Archons is a future of reconciliation in which the fractures of history are healed by the remembrance of shared origin. The transformation also extends to humanity's relationship with creation. Under archonic influence, the material world is experienced as a prison, exploited and corrupted for control. But once freed, matter itself can be redeemed, recognized as a manifestation of divine energy, rather than a counterfeit trap. The earth, long ravaged by greed and domination, can become a sacred dwelling again. In mystical visions, this appears as the new earth, a reality in which nature and humanity exist in harmony, no longer distorted by the parasitic hunger of archonic systems. Technology, too, can be transfigured, no longer a tool of surveillance or distraction, but a servant of wisdom, creativity, and healing. The liberation of the soul is perhaps the most profound promise of the post-archonic future. Without the deception of false lights and counterfeit heavens, souls can ascend freely to the higher realms of the source. The cycle of reincarnation manipulated by the Archons dissolves as humanity remembers its eternal home. Death itself loses its sting, for it is no longer a passage back into prison, but a gateway into freedom. This shift transforms life as well. When people no longer fear death, they no longer live enslaved to survival or manipulation. Courage, joy, and love become the natural modes of existence. Importantly, the future beyond the Archons is not only a cosmic event, but a daily practice. Each moment of awakening here and now foreshadows that greater liberation. When individuals refuse fear, when they choose love over division, when they recognize truth beyond illusion, they already live in the reality beyond the Archons. The kingdom of God, as Christ declared, is within and among us. The apocalypse may mark its full unveiling, but its seeds are already planted in the hearts of those who awaken. Thus, the post-archonic future is not only something to wait for, but something to build moment by moment through conscious living. Finally, the vision of life beyond the Archons is a call to responsibility. Liberation is not the end of the journey, but the beginning. Without counterfeit rulers, humanity must choose how to shape its destiny. Will we embody the wisdom of the source, or will we recreate new prisons of our own making? The promise of freedom comes with the challenge of maturity. True sovereignty means not only rejecting false rulers, but also embracing the divine responsibility to create with love, truth, and balance. The future beyond the Archons is therefore both a hope and a test. It is the unveiling of a world in which fear, ignorance, and deception have no dominion, and the divine spark within every soul shines without obstruction. It is also the challenge of living in alignment with that light, ensuring that liberation becomes not just a cosmic possibility, but a lived reality. To step into this future is to finally reclaim what was always ours. The freedom, the wisdom, and the eternal connection to the source that no counterfeit ruler can ever take away. As we come to the close of this journey into the mystery of the Archons, the question that began our exploration returns with greater weight. Who are they really, and why does their story matter so deeply for us? Today, we have seen them in the pages of Gnostic scripture hinted at in the Bible, mirrored in Jewish and Islamic mysticism, disguised in mythology, and reframed in modern psychology and culture. We have traced their tools of deception, fear, ignorance, false authority, and illusion. And we have examined how they manipulate not only societies, but the human mind, and even the destiny of the soul. They are the jailers of humanity, unseen, yet deeply present counterfeit rulers, whose dominion thrives only so long as we remain blind to their schemes. And yet the deeper we looked, the more their weakness became clear. The Archons cannot extinguish the divine spark within us. They cannot create true life. They cannot inspire genuine love, and they cannot hold power over a soul that remembers its source. Their entire dominion depends on deception, on convincing us that they are strong when they are hollow, that they are divine when they are counterfeit, that their systems of fear are eternal, when in truth they are temporary. To recognize this is already to weaken their grip. The moment humanity remembers who we truly are, the chains of illusion begin to break. This is why the teachings of Christ and the wisdom of the mystics have always emphasized remembrance. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. That freedom is not merely political or social, it is metaphysical. It is the liberation of the soul from the counterfeit world of the Archons. Christ's triumph was not just victory over death, but victory over the rulers of this age, disarming their principalities and exposing their impotence. His resurrection revealed what the Archons fear most, that the divine spark cannot be contained, and that awakening spreads like light through a darkened room. The story of the Archons is not meant to paralyze us with fear, but to awaken us to vigilance and courage. Fear, after all, is their oldest weapon. But when fear is replaced with discernment, with love, and with faith, their power evaporates. This is why every tradition that has encountered archonic forces has also preserved a path of resistance. The Gnostics spoke of gnosis, the direct knowledge of the source. The Kabbalists spoke of ascending the tree of life beyond the husks of the cliff oath. The Sufis and Muslims spoke of remembrance of Allah as the shield against whispering jinn. The Christian mystics spoke of union with Christ, the light that no darkness can overcome. All of these paths converge on one truth: the Archons can only imprison those who forget who they are. Today, as in ancient times, the signs of archonic influence are everywhere. Division, fear, endless distraction, and systems of authority that claim legitimacy but lack compassion. To see these patterns is not paranoia. It is the first step toward clarity. The world may appear dominated by counterfeit rulers, but each act of awakening disrupts their system. Every moment of truth spoken, every act of love given, every refusal to bow to fear is a victory against the Archons. These small acts ripple outward, eroding the foundations of their counterfeit reality until it collapses altogether. And so the final question falls to us. Will we remain prisoners in their illusion, or will we claim the freedom that has always been ours? The Archons cannot decide for us. They can only deceive. The choice is humanity's to awaken, or to slumber to remember, or to forget to live as divine sparks of the source, or as cogs in the counterfeit machine. The scriptures, the mystics, and the prophets all remind us, the rulers of this age are doomed to pass away, but the light within us is eternal. Let this knowledge not remain abstract, but become a living fire within. Let it guide us to vigilance, to discernment, and to love that breaks fear. Let it remind us that no jailer can imprison a soul that remembers its origin. The Archons may still whisper, but their voices are fading, for the age of unveiling is at hand. Humanity's task is to see to awaken and to walk through the open door of freedom that has always been waiting